and actually claims to generate no revenue from commercial activity for their public broadcaster. And so I'll start with just asking this question of whether we actually should be spending more money on public media in general, or on CBC in general. Maybe, Jean, we can start with you.
Yes. Well, I think that part of what we have to take into account when we think about comparing the amount that Canada spends on public broadcasting to the amount that other countries spend on public broadcasting is that Canada's really big and not very dense, and that's really challenging. And there's basically one country that's bigger and less dense than us, and we don't. One of the things that we just really don't do in Canada is decide, well, those northern communities don't really need the CBC. And we're also doing all that we do in more languages than the vast majority of other countries in the world. So there are countries with more national languages, and there are countries with more indigenous languages for sure, but this kind of combination of lots of languages and lots of land is pretty unique to us, and we do a pretty amazing job actually covering it, considering what we have to work with. And I mean, this question is, I feel like this is a question that we've been answering, like we as the Canadian Media Guild have been answering for probably 20 years, and the answer has always been yes. The answer has always been, we need more money, and now there are funding cuts, and so the question, the demand is not now restore us to our previous levels of funding, it's restore us to higher levels of funding than we had going into these cuts. And also, importantly, that funding needs to not be, the way that it works every year is every year the CBC finds out how much money it's going to have when the budget comes down. So there's no long-term stable funding. And what that means is that it's very hard to make long-term plans when you only know how much money you're going to have for 9 months. And as a broadcaster, that's really impossible to work with. And so what I would say is not only does there need to be more money, it needs to be long-term funding so that you can look 5 years down the road, and it needs to be stable. So does that answer?
I just want to add to that in terms of funding. A lot of the excuses that are made to justify cuts like this are that CBC doesn't make good use of money, that it's bloated, it's inefficient, it's bureaucratic, blah 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 blah, and that it's too inefficient, and that the public sector or private sector media can do a better job with money, is more efficient. So that's where our ad dollars should be going. We should be reassigning funding to where it's used most efficiently. That was crap. David Beers, who's the founder of the Tyee, told me a story one time that gives me a weird kind of hope, backwards hope, in that it's really unfortunate that there's people in this world as powerful and as rich as Conrad Black who can finance really, really big media conglomerates. But what's really reassuring about that is that, I mean, Conrad Black, for the last 10 years he was running papers, never made money on them. I mean, they were always failing. They were hemorrhaging money. These things were always sinking ships. Conrad Black was making a lot of money through embezzlement, and he ended up in prison because of it. But I mean, the notion that the private sector can do a better job of resourcing and funding media is complete crap. And you only have to look at the way that major media conglomerates are perpetually in huge amounts of debt, are perpetually losing money, are always scrambling to conglomerate as a short-term solution to their perpetual financial mismanagement. So that's just sort of something I wanted to point out as well.
I just want to add that part of the discussion of how do we solve our problems with money is completely embedded in the discussion of what kind of society can we live in. Is capitalism this eternal destiny that we are, destined to follow it and live through? And I would argue no. And I think here's where the CBC and many of our community radios need to play a role, not just in looking at the problems that an economic crisis such as the one we're living today has created for us, but what does it mean to continuously recreate the same system over and over? The capitalist system has been running on Band-Aids for a long time. The recurrent cyclical crisis that we have seen are, make a lot of people hemorrhaging, and we have this idea that once we hit bottom, we'll change our ways. once we hit bottom. And I'm here to tell you that this will not work, because the ones who hit bottom are always the ones who are suffering the consequences. The people who are benefiting from maintaining this system of power over the system of hierarchy, of patriarchy, of colonial power will never hit bottom. You know, there's always a new bottom that we as people can hit. And so we need to begin a new discussion. What will it look to have a different society? Ones that organize their economics in a participatory way. Ones that envisions autonomy. One that recognizes the rights of indigenous people not as being against, you know, our own survival, but rather that sees our own aspirations for justice to be in tandem with the liberation and autonomy of other people, of all people. So that, I think, needs to be central to the CBC radio. If we want to be relevant, we need to start giving people a new vision. No one wants to be on a losing team. I don't know about you, but I don't fight because, you know, it's the good fight. No. I want to win. I want the side of people who are good. We're the good people. We should be winning. So we need to have a plan. We need to create a plan and and create possibilities for us to engage, for us to collaborate, and make sure that regardless of what the government chooses to do, we will continue to have a voice. We will continue to break down those structures of power and create something that respects our humanity, who we are.
Tyler, in the work that you did with Reimagine CBC, was there ever a sense of knowing that Canadians do support the idea of a public broadcaster? Was there ever a sense as to why the government is able to get away? Like, it didn't matter which party, but governments have been able to incrementally cut the CBC's funding since its beginning.
Well, I think, use words, Tyler. I think what I found watching the conversation on our Facebook page or on the Twitter or at the event, we had a series of live events as well where we would have discussion groups and these sorts of things. What I found is there's a lot of these people in this country who love the idea of public media but don't necessarily love the CBC. There's a lot of people who are on the fence who can very easily be pushed either way. And because of this sort of dominant cultural narrative that we have that Sylvia's done such a good job drawing our attention to, of that all that matters is efficiency, and it's sort of this neutral economic argument, that's the only argument we need to make. People who advocate for the privatization or the dismembering of the CBC can very easily take those people in the middle and go push them over to the con side. So there was one interaction that I had on the Reimagine Facebook page where somebody came on steaming, just like so angry about the way that they perceived that the CBC was irresponsible with money. And I think the case they were pointing out was it was pretty legit. Like it felt like a legitimate gripe. So this was one of those people who was like, look, I've always supported the CBC, but this pissed me off. That person who could have very easily turned on or read the National Post, like read a column in the National Post or seen something on some TV about how CBC funds porn in Quebec, like, come on. Because they show soap operas. That's a fun story, you should have done. Somebody who very easily could have popped over to the negative side by encountering one of those stories. It was a space where we could talk through that complaint with them and say, look, there is an environment where you can go, and it's this online brainstorm, and your idea can be taken seriously and seen by a really big user community and potentially become part of this like big sort of crowdsourced consultation. And I think, and by the end of this conversation on the Facebook page, they were sold. You know, they weren't necessarily pro-CBC yet, but that anger that would have pushed them away from it was now sort of, that energy was like re-corralled towards thinking critically and thinking collaboratively about a solution to the problem, as opposed to just disengaging and being cynical about it. So I think really creating environments and consultative spaces where people can feel ownership, and not ownership only, but feel like their ideas can be heard beyond like sort of just like mute anger at a TV or a computer. It was really, really powerful, and there were instances where you could talk people through, and whether or not they end up on your side is up for question, but at the very least they're not on the other side. And I think that was a really powerful example of sort of what a collaborative, participatory kind of media environment can do and really increase the sort of public purchase over their media.
I just want to shift now to any questions that you might have for one another. And do you have a, Jean, if you might have a question for Tyler or for Sylvia or...
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this panel and thinking about sitting here with the two of you, one question that I found really fascinating, Sylvia, was community radio is it's a very fundamental. Well, it's community based, right? So it's fundamentally a very local thing, and yet your show is globally syndicated and has global audiences. And I'm wondering how for you that connection between the very, very local and the very, very rooted and grounded in a community and the kind of international, the international context, the international audience, and this how you kind of relate those two.
I think that it doesn't matter who you are or how much money you make. At some point, we're all grounded, right? Anything we do comes from the land, comes from the place where we are. And so for us, Latin Waves began as a process to try to connect people to the changes that were taking place in Latin America. We were looking at the indigenous resistance in Bolivia and the election of Evo Morales, you know, as the first indigenous leader to come to power and to create a new vision for the entire country. To have now, in Bolivia, they have a new constitution that's not just for people, where women have 50% of the seats in government, but also a constitution that recognizes the rights of nature. So to me, it was a catalyst moment that we are living. And I wanted us to be connected to that, to realize that those things are also happening here. Right here in British Columbia, you know, as we see the government pushing a pipeline, right? We're all focused on the Enbridge pipeline, and this is good. You know, it's brought a lot of people, a lot of groups that normally didn't work together, brought them together. But what are we losing when we focus on the pipeline and ignore all the other carbon energy, you know, projects that they're proposing, all the minings, the coal mining that is being expanded? What are we missing, right? When we win this battle, the question I ask is, what will we do then? Will we simply retreat and ignore the fact that many indigenous communities are living in treacherous conditions, without potable water, you know, without proper food? Will we ignore that? And so, to me, reporting about what is happening here and connecting it to what is happening in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world is part of recognizing that we're not unlike a garden. You know, we're constantly seeding, right? And we all have fruit. We all have seeds. And so sometimes we need to look at other places to learn how we can best take care of our own roots, best take care of our seeds so they germinate and grow. Other times it's easier to learn those lessons from somewhere else than look critically at ourselves. And so it's part of this self-reflection and self-connection to the places where we belong. We need to learn to love where we are. What does this place mean to us? You know, someone asked me, describe the place where you come from, you know, and immediately people want you to give them a country or something. But to me, the description is very simple. I come from a place of mountains. I come from a place where the ocean meets, you know, the valley in a beautiful way, where El Salvador has all this tiny little mountain, you know, it's a very small country, but within that you have a variety of ecosystems. And so here in Coast Salish territory, a lot of similarities come to mind, right? So I feel connected, but I think more than that, we need to recognize that that connection is so vulnerable when we don't take care, right, of the actions that are being done in our name or the kinds of policies that